So today on Spark, how technology is changing music. We've got a whole new look at musical chairs. The Emoti-Chair is designed to bring a rich musical experience to deaf people. And MP3s, sure, they're waterproof and they don't scratch, but how are they changing the way songwriters and producers craft tunes? Just in time for the Junos, it's a very musical Spark.
Music was directly affected by the change in technology.
Say there, have you ever thought about technology and music? Like how early recording and playback technology produced music that sounded one way.
And now it sounds, well, kind of like this.
I can put you in a log cabin, somewhere in Aspen.
But here's a question for you. What does the new technology of digital recording and MP3s mean for the craft of pop songwriting? The other day, I came across an intriguing blog post about this music prof at Stanford.
My name is Jonathan Berger. I'm a professor of music, composer, and researcher at Stanford University.
And about 8 years ago, Jonathan did an experiment with some of his students. He played them a number of pieces of music. Some were original recordings, completely uncompressed, full quality. Some of the others were compressed, crunched down using a variety of methods, including one you're probably familiar with, MP3.
So we tested on a variety of musical clips, orchestral and jazz and a variety of rock and roll types. What I began to see was that uncompressed audio was winning out in many situations, but in rock music, MP3s, and particularly, and this was entirely strange to me, MP3s with not terribly high bit rates, like 128, for example, seemed to be doing very well with rock music.
So for certain kinds of music, Jonathan's students actually preferred the lower quality digital files, which is kind of surprising. So Jonathan repeated the experiment each year with new students. And
curiously saw a rise of preference for MP3 at 128 kilobits on particular types of rock music. So this was an anomaly that was totally unexpected. And it began to raise the question of whether there's something happening in the degraded quality of the reconstruction that somehow seems to enhance the actual music.
When you compress a digital music file using the MP3 format, particular parts of that music are emphasized. Do you hear the ch of those cymbals? The tone of that high-pitched guitar riff? That's what Jonathan's talking about.
I like to call them sizzle. Mm-hmm. You sort of hear this bright noise, sort of chaotic noise burst. It seems to really enhance cymbal hits and distortion guitar particularly at high frequencies. And so it seems to me, and this is my guess, that what we're looking at is a degradation in audio quality that somehow, and maybe there's a feedback loop here, seem to do well under certain circumstances where noise and distortion were integral parts of the music.
But I have to wonder, if Jonathan's students actually preferred the sizzly, compressed sound of an MP3, what does this do to the idea of things being better or worse quality? Is there an objective standard of better audio, or is it just what people prefer? Jonathan says yes and no, it's kind of, sort of both. And ultimately,
great music remains great music under a variety of conditions. So a great piece of Bach you can listen to on a transistor radio, and the greatness of the music will somehow still come through. Not that I advise that.
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're most welcome, Nora.
Jonathan Berger is a professor of music at Stanford University.
Well, you know that the phenomenon called sound is a wave in the air, pulsing at a certain speed. Now, these waves hit the eardrum and are turned into vibrations, which the brain translates into what we call sound.
So, if MP3s are changing the way we listen to some pop music, how is it changing the way we make music?
I'm Carl Wilson. I'm a music writer for the Globe and Mail and for Zoilist.com, and the author of Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste.
So do you think it's possible that we're getting a new kind of aesthetic, a new sort of taste in various kinds of pop music because of this?
I think that's precisely what happens.
I wanted to talk to Carl Wilson because I wanted to know how these new methods of compression and digital distribution affect the way musicians write and producers produce pop songs. Do you have to change the way you write or produce a song if you know it's going to be compressed as an MP3 and heard over computer speakers, or turned into a cell phone ringtone, or a 30-second sample on iTunes? Carl told me there's a long history of technology influencing the pop music aesthetic of the time. When new technologies become available in the recording studio or as the means of consumption, they change the way we write, produce, and listen to music.
In the early days of recording, you had the initial 78s and 45s, which were limited to a couple of minutes long, and so that became what a pop song was, and then we still live with the legacy of that. The idea that a pop song is still sort of an average of about 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, is a legacy of how much you could fit on a vinyl recording at that time. And similarly now, I think we're getting a sort of ringtone style aesthetic where what the kind of most prized thing in a pop song tends to be now is that particularly sort of crafted little beat and vocal effect that accompany it, and that those are the kinds of, and there's this intense competition among producers to outdo each other at that, and so that becomes kind of what the arena is, and on the Billboard charts is each of these producers vying off to kind of create that moment. And I think there's always a tendency, as in these moments of transition, to see that as somehow more decadent than what we had before. And I don't think that necessarily is the most productive way to say it. I think you just sort of see it as a phase in pop history where this becomes the arena of competition, and that's where the creativity is being applied. And it's important to kind of keen your ear on that and enjoy the fruits of that.
Right. So when you listen, you listen to tons of new music. When you listen to various types of genres of new music, how are you hearing that play out in terms of the styles that are turning up and so on?
Well, one side of it is definitely this very, very strong rhythmic emphasis, which I think has been true for most of this decade, and I think that has accompanied this shift to MP3 listening and all of that kind of thing. Another thing you're getting are these very unique kind of textural effects, because, again, that's something that can be communicated right away. As soon as the song begins, you have a whole sound universe created for that song. And one of the outgrowths of that, and again, something that's suited to being listened to on the media that people are listening to, is the autotune vocal effect, which kind of has ruled the charts for the past couple of years through T-Pain and all of his ilk.
Yeah.
Hey. And again, it's a sound that leaps out, definitely sounds of the moment, and sounds good on your computer speakers.
So that's like when you get the kind of digitized effect on people's voices.
Yeah, you get that kind of warbly robotic sound, and that's achieved by kind of turning pitch correction software into an instrument in a way, and turning it up to such an extreme that the voice, rather than just sort of being pulled slightly into pitch, is jumping wildly between pitches, and has no in between, and that creates this kind of 21st century yodel.
Right. People have probably heard that in the I'm embarrassed that I know this, but the Cher I Do You Believe song, where it's that
that was kind of the founding document of it, but now it's now it's on sort of every R&B and hip hop song.
So what do you think that means for how people who have grown used to hearing music written for MP3s, how do they then go back and hear older vinyl recordings?
Well, I think you always hear, and changes of medium are probably one of the starker representations of this, but every decade or every period in pop music, you have a set of sort of production techniques that are signature of that time and have to do with what was available and what's possible. So, people go back and listen to vinyl. Partly they're going to hear music that's made, with a very different set of instruments and a very different set of technologies, and that's kind of going to be primary, I think, in the difference that they hear. But also, you do have sort of a generation now that's never heard, except perhaps as an artificial effect on, intended to signify that maybe you're doing something retro, has never heard a crackle or a scratch on a vinyl record, and isn't used to the sort of ongoing background noise that goes on in vinyl. And so though to you or I who grew up with that, that might signal a certain kind of warmth, and we might have nostalgic feelings about that sound. It would make perfect sense to me if an 18-year-old was going to listen to that and think that sounds terrible.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So it sounds like you don't think of it in terms of it being a loss. It's just different, and the technology always changes, and therefore the music style always changes.
I mean, I think if you kind of step back and take the historical view, it's very easy to react to every change as a loss because we do get attached to the music that we grew up with and the sounds that we grew up with. But when you look at it over sort of a longer timeline, it starts to become impossible to sustain that argument, because really then, everybody would be recording on wax cylinders and singing into, a giant horn.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Thanks a lot, Carl.
You're welcome.
There are longer interviews with both Carl Wilson and Jonathan Berger up at the Spark blog, cbc.ca/spark. You're listening to Spark on CBC Radio 1. I'm Nora Young, and with the Junos around the corner, we're doing a special music edition of the show. And as convenient as it can be to listen to music on an MP3 player, nothing really beats the experience of a live band. That band, it's not at a club. I was listening to them play in a room at Ryerson University in Toronto, where I was trying out the Emoti-Chair. It's a Ryerson research project, and the idea is to design a chair that would give deaf people a richer experience of music. The Emoti-Chair looks like a recliner, but when you sit in it, different instruments are represented by vibrations and pulses that you feel on different parts of your body. The coolest part was rippling vibrations that came up from the armrests and stimulated my forearms. It almost felt like a bit of a current running up to my shoulders, making them wiggle in time to the music. It made me want to dance, more than just standing there listening to the music did. But I could also feel thumping and jerking in my chest and other vibrations in different parts of my body. Vibrations travel up your arms.
So I'm Ellen. My last name is Hibbert. I'm a second-year PhD student.
Ellen is deaf. She's signing her answers. The voice you hear is her interpreter, Tala Jalili. Ellen's been trying out the Emoti-Chair, and before using the chair...
In terms of listening to music, I could feel vibrations, but in terms of touching a speaker, touching the woofer with my hands, I could just feel one speaker booming. So the first time that I had the woofers in my back, strapped on, I was astounded. I feel like it opened up a whole new world for me, a whole new world of music, and I very much enjoyed it.
The way Ellen explains it, the effect of separating the instruments into vibrations on different parts of the body is a revelation.
But it can bring tears to my eyes about how much I can feel music. I can feel the piano. I can distinguish the instruments. I've never known that piano and guitar felt different. Growing up, it was quite different. I had hearing aids. They tried for me to experience music. It was just a mumble-jumble of sounds to me. It just was not possible. I'm profoundly deaf. I've never been able to separate sounds.
What role does music play in deaf culture generally?
In the deaf community, we typically, let's say if we host a dance or have a gathering, we typically will do it where there's wooden planks on the floor. So when there are drums or there is bass, we take off our shoes, and then we can feel it through the vibrations in the wood. So that's how the deaf community experiences music.
But what if you could separate the music into its component parts? Maria Karam is a postdoc fellow at Ryerson. She works with human-computer interactions.
Imagine putting your hands on a speaker that's playing the music. You can feel vibrations, but what we can normally feel are the most prominent low-level bass and drum-type vibrations, and these dominate all of the other frequencies, such as the voice or the guitar and some of the higher frequencies that aren't accessible. So because the body is very capable of processing information, a lot more than we actually use it for, what we're doing is leveraging this ability, and we're separating music into multiple signals or channels, and we're presenting each of those individual unique channels along your body, giving your body the chance to process it, strictly bypassing your ears, but tickling your upper back or pounding on your lower thigh.
So in some ways, your whole body is a sensory organ. Beyond the cool factor, what impressed me was the way sensing music more deeply isn't just an aesthetic experience, but an emotional one, according to Ellen Hibbert.
Did you get that sense from listening to it, what kind of emotions were being communicated by the composer?
Oh, certainly. And my mind wanders and goes off into an emotional roller coaster of experience. For the first time, I realized I was pushing my buttons, pushing my emotions, making me feel emotions that I never knew were associated with music. It was never an experience, and I have to say, I like it.
The rock band wasn't the only music I heard that day at Ryerson. There was also music composed specifically for use with the Emoti-Chair.
My name is Stefan Vera, and I'm the first composer in the world to be composing for a new tactile medium, which is the Emoti-Chair. I realized very quickly that I was allowing my senses, specifically my hearing, to influence me because I was, hitting notes that would be more related to one another. And I said, this is not the way to proceed. If a deaf person is going to get something out of it, then I better be composing, for a deaf person who cannot hear anything. So I pumped TV static into my ears so as to not allow any outside sound, and relied entirely on me sitting in the chair with a keyboard on my lap and the vibrations to dictate how I was going to, start the composition.
And how, as a composer, how do you feel when you hear the reactions that we heard in the room today from the people who were using it and what their experience of it is?
To me, it is a more honest reaction than someone who's been listening to music their whole life and just, says they like your piece. To have made such a difference in someone's life who otherwise was closed off to music completely and didn't want it a part of his or her life, to have that person say, wow, you've completely changed my mind about music, it's very, very special, it's very meaningful, and I really want that to be for everybody.
I got really caught up with the image of experiencing music as more than just sound, but as a tactile experience too. And that made me think about this cool book I just read. Okay, this is a totally different phenomenon. I want to be clear about this, but it does involve the senses. And this is where Richard comes in.
This is Richard Saitowic. I'm a neurologist in Washington, D.C.
For some people, the way they experience the world around them all the time involves a kind of crossing of the senses. And Richard has been studying this fascinating sensory phenomenon. It all goes back to one night nearly 20 years ago.
I was invited to a neighbor's house for dinner, and he delayed our seating at the table with the apology that there weren't enough points on the chicken. And everybody laughed and said, "Oh, Michael, what are you smoking?" etc.
Right. How could a neurologist not be intrigued by Michael and his pointy chicken, right?
So when Michael says, "I taste shapes," I didn't say, "Oh, you can't do that. You're crazy." I said, isn't that interesting? Maybe how we think the brain is organized isn't right.
People who study this now think that 1 in 23 people have some kind of crossing of the senses. It's called synesthesia. So, obvious question first, what is synesthesia?
Well, everybody knows the word anesthesia, which means no sensation. Synesthesia means joined sensation. And there are people born with 2 or more of their senses hooked together, so that my voice, for example, is not only something that they hear, but also something that they might see or smell or feel as a physical touch.
There are all kinds of synesthesia. Some people see a color when they see a particular letter or number, or they might experience the taste of a particular word. One of the more common forms is colored hearing, where a sound is associated with something visual.
They don't see like a pictorial thing of, sheep scambling through a meadow when they listen to Beethoven. They see very elementary aspects of perception. So color, movement, scintillation, size, shape, geometry, replication, etc.
Do we know what causes synesthesia?
Well, being human is the bottom line, but there is a gene, the synesthesia gene, that causes 1 in 23 people to have some kind of synesthesia, and 1 in 90 people see letters and numbers as colored. And so, for example, one man who's a musician, whenever he hears music, he sees this in front of him, like a TV screen about a foot or so in front of his face, and the shapes and lines move. And if he turns his head, then the screen moves with his head. But if you ask him where the shapes are coming from, he says, well, it comes from the direction of the music. Like if I'm at a live concert, then it's coming from them.
Can we talk a bit about the implications for art? I mean, first of all, is it true that artists are more likely to be synesthetes?
Yes, we've known for a long time that synesthesia is more common in creative people such as writers and painters and musicians. Some famous ones, of course, are Vladimir Nabokov, the author, David Hockney, a painter, Olivier Messiaen, the famous French composer, who invented an entire method of composition specifically to convey the colors of sound.
Yeah, the list of composers and musicians.
And there's modern ones, too. For example, Stevie Wonder, Billy Joel, although they don't talk about it in public because I think they're a little worried about what their fans might think.
Yeah, can we talk a bit about the list of composers and musicians? We've got Liszt, Rimsky-Korsakov, Sibelius, Eddie Van Halen, Stevie Wonder, who all have this kind of colored hearing. You know, are there any kind of commonalities that we can say about what that means for their music, or is it completely idiosyncratic to every...
Well, what the composer does with it really depends on his artistic temperament. So Billy Joel said he was writing a lullaby that's in hunter green for his child. Liszt and Rimsky-Korsakov did this. For example, when Liszt was a Kapellmeister, he would say, "Please, gentlemen, more red, if you please." And of course, the musicians looked at him and thought, what is he talking about? And Messiaen says the same thing. He says he's even written specifically what the colors in the score are so that the conductor can convey that information so that the woodwinds will play more blue, the brass will play more yellow, etc.
Because, you know, this is the interesting thing, and you talk about this in the book, the whole idea of metaphor, which for all of us involves this kind of crossing of the senses, you know.
Yes, we're all synesthetic, and the brain is already cross-wired among the senses in all of us. So in synesthesia, the question is, how much?
Yeah, I mean, one of the points you make in the book is that people who are synesthetes often don't realize that there's anything unusual going on there. They imagine that everybody...
Exactly. As children, they're often shocked to discover that their playmates are not like them. And they'll say something like, "Oh, A is the most beautiful pink I've ever seen," or "Oh, that music is so round and silver." And they get withering looks from their parents. You know, the parents think they're making it up. They want too much attention. And so that they retreat and think, "Oh, I'm the only one in the world like this." And now, of course, we know that far from being rare, synesthesia is extremely common. And the question is, what good does it do? Because walking around, you know, hearing colors or seeing letters is colored really doesn't have much evolutionary purpose. And what we think it is a gene for creativity. And what this gene does is make us able to make connections between seemingly different things. And that's the definition of metaphor, seeing the similar in the dissimilar.
Richard, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
You can find a link to Richard's book and his research at our blog, cbc.ca/spark.